My name is Marcus Thorne, and I remember every moment of what it felt like to have my soul carved away piece by piece, replaced with something that should never have existed in the same reality as human consciousness. The needle piercing my skull was just the beginning. A ceremonial first cut in a procedure that would strip away everything I had ever been and rebuild it in service to forces that viewed humanity as nothing more than convenient raw material. I had been a loyal servant of Inquisitor Vex for 8 years before he decided I was ready for the ultimate honor. 8 years of faithful service, 8 years of following orders without question, 8 years of believing that my devotion to the Imperial cause made me special. I was wrong. My devotion simply made me useful. The Inquisitor explained it to me in his private chambers while I knelt before his desk like a penitent seeking absolution. The enemy we faced on Ganna Prime was beyond conventional weapons, he said. The heretic cult that had infected the planet's population was being guided by something from the warp, something that laughed at laser guns and ignored chainswords. To fight such an enemy, the Inquisition needed weapons that existed on the same plane of reality as their foes. "You understand what I am asking of you," Mordian said, his augmetic eye whirring as it focused on my face. "This is not a mission you will return from unchanged. What emerges from the binding chamber will serve the Emperor's will, but it will no longer be Marcus Thorne." I accepted without hesitation. 8 years of conditioning had prepared me for this moment, had shaped my mind until the concept of personal survival seemed selfish and irrelevant compared to the needs of the Imperium. I was ready to die for the Emperor. I thought I was ready to become something else for him as well. I was not ready for what actually happened. The preparation began immediately. I was taken to the depths of the inquisitorial fortress on Scintilla, where chambers existed that did not appear on any official blueprints. The tech priests who maintained these facilities worked in complete silence, their vows of secrecy enforced by neural conditioning that would kill them if they attempted to discuss their duties with unauthorized personnel. The descent through the fortress was a journey through layers of increasingly ancient architecture. The upper levels were familiar to me, standard imperial construction with the usual Baroque decorations and devotional murals. But as we went deeper, the corridors became older, carved from living rock and lined with symbols that predated the Imperium by millennia. "How old is this place?" I asked Tech Adept Zarek as we passed through a chamber whose walls were covered with hieroglyphs that hurt to look at directly. "The fortress was built on the ruins of a pre-imperial site," he replied, his mechanical voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Archaeological surveys suggest that these lower levels were once part of a temple complex dedicated to entities whose names have been struck from all official records. The Inquisition chose this location because the existing psychic resonances make it easier to contain warp-based phenomena." The implications were disturbing. The Inquisition had deliberately built their Daemonhost creation facility on top of a site that was already tainted by chaos worship. They were using the residual corruption to power their own summoning rituals, turning the enemy's own tools against them in a way that seemed both brilliant and blasphemous. I was stripped of my clothing, my weapons, my identity tags, everything that marked me as an individual human being rather than raw material for the Inquisition's purposes. My body was cleaned with chemicals that burned my skin and left me feeling hollow, as if something essential had been scraped away along with the superficial dirt and oils. The chemical bath was conducted in a chamber that looked more like a medici facility than anything connected to demonic summoning. Banks of monitoring equipment tracked my vital signs while servitors applied caustic solutions that dissolved the outer layers of my skin. The process was described as spiritual purification, but it felt more like being dissolved alive. The cleansing removes not just physical contaminants, but also psychic residue accumulated through normal human interaction, Zarek explained as he monitored the readings on his instruments. "Every person you have ever touched, every emotion you have ever felt, Every thought you have ever shared with another human being leaves traces on your soul. These must be eliminated before the daemon can take proper residence. The physical preparation was followed by spiritual conditioning. For 3 days, I was subjected to prayer cycles that lasted 18 hours each, led by a confessor whose face had been replaced by a mechanical vox grill. The prayers were not the familiar litanies of imperial faith, but older words in languages that predated the founding of the Imperium. They hurt to speak, leaving my throat raw and my mind feeling strangely detached from my body. The confessor introduced himself as Brother Malleus, though I suspected that was not his original name. His transformation was more extensive than most tech priests, with mechanical components replacing not just his vocal apparatus but also his hands, his eyes, and what appeared to be significant portions of his torso. When he moved, I could hear servos whining and pneumatic systems cycling as his artificial muscles responded to neural commands. The prayers you will recite were discovered in archives beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, he explained as he handed me a data slate containing the texts I was expected to memorize. They are fragments of the Emperor's own words, spoken during the early days of his war against the forces of chaos. Each syllable has been sanctified by decades of scholarly analysis and theological review, but when I began to read the prayers, I realized that something was wrong with them. The words seemed to shift and change on the page, their meanings becoming fluid and uncertain. What started as a blessing to the Emperor would slowly transform into something that sounded more like an invocation of darker powers. The text was infected with chaos corruption, though so subtly that it might take years of study to identify the specific alterations. "Brother Malleus," I said during one of our sessions, "these prayers seem to contain elements that are not entirely orthodox. Some of the phrasing appears to—" "The prayers are exactly as they should be," he interrupted, his mechanical voice carrying a tone that discouraged further questions. "Your perception of irregularities is a symptom of spiritual preparation. As your mind becomes more receptive to the forces you will need to contain, you will naturally become more sensitive to the subtle currents of the warp. What seems like corruption is actually enhanced awareness." During this preparation period, I was allowed to observe other subjects who had undergone the same process. Inquisitor Mordian maintained a collection of successful Daemonhosts in specialized containment chambers deep beneath the fortress. These beings had once been human, loyal servants like myself who had volunteered to serve the Emperor in the most extreme way possible. Now they were something else entirely. The first one I encountered was designated Alpha 7, a former arbitrator who had been bound with a demon of corn nearly a decade earlier. The creature that had once been a man stood 3 meters tall, its skin replaced by armor that seemed to be grown rather than worn. Its eyes burned with constant fire, and when it moved, the air around it shimmered with heat waves that could melt steel. The containment cell was a masterwork of inquisitorial engineering, equipped with every safeguard that centuries of experience had deemed necessary for holding entities that existed partially in the warp. The walls were carved from blessed stone and inscribed with words in dozens of languages. Psychic dampening fields created a null zone that prevented the Daemonhost from accessing the full extent of its supernatural abilities. Physical restraints forged from materials that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously ensured that even beings with superhuman strength could not break free. "Do not stare too long," advised Tech Adept Zarek, who was conducting my tour of the facility. "The demon within recognizes observers and may attempt to establish psychic contact. Such contact would compromise your own binding procedure." But I found it impossible to look away. Alpha 7 had retained just enough human characteristics to be recognizable as having once been a person, but everything else about it spoke of alien intelligence and inhuman purpose. It watched me through the transparent aluminum walls of its cell with the patient attention of a predator waiting for feeding time. "How long has it been contained?" I asked. 9 years, 4 months, 17 days, Zarek replied without consulting any data source. "It has shown no signs of degradation in the binding matrix and continues to perform assigned tasks with optimal efficiency." "What kind of tasks?" "Interrogation, primarily. The demon's connection to Khorne grants it an intuitive understanding of violence and pain that makes it extremely effective at extracting information from reluctant subjects. It can identify the precise combination of physical and psychological trauma required to break any individual's resistance without causing irreparable damage to their cognitive functions." The next cell contained Beta 3, a former tech priest who had been possessed by a demon of Tzeentch. The transformation had been even more radical than Alpha 7's. The creature's body seemed to exist in a constant state of flux, its form shifting and changing as I watched. One moment it appeared to be made of living crystal. The next it resembled a configuration of geometric shapes that hurt to perceive directly. "This one requires more careful handling," Zarek explained. "The Changer of Ways grants its servants abilities that can affect local reality in unpredictable ways. We have lost 3 maintenance personnel to unexpected spatial distortions during routine cell cleaning procedures." "What does it do for the Inquisition?" "Analysis and prediction. The demon can perceive probability streams and temporal fluctuations that allow it to anticipate enemy actions with remarkable accuracy. During the Kithara campaign, its predictions enabled our forces to intercept 6 separate chaos incursions before they could establish stable footholds in real space. The tour continued through dozens of cells, each one containing what had once been a human being but was now something that existed at the intersection of imperial service and demonic possession. Some retained recognizably human forms, while others had been so completely transformed that their original species was a matter of speculation rather than observation. Gamma 1 had been bound with a demon of Nurgle and now served as a living weapon against biological warfare. Its body was a walking ecosystem of diseases and plagues, each one carefully controlled to target specific genetic markers associated with enemy populations. The creature could walk through a crowd of heretics and infect them with terminal illnesses while leaving loyal Imperial citizens completely unharmed. Delta 5 carried a demon of Slaanesh and specialized in infiltration and espionage. Its supernatural charisma and enhanced empathic abilities made it capable of manipulating human emotions with surgical precision. It could convince anyone of anything given sufficient time and opportunity, making it invaluable for operations requiring deep cover or the corruption of enemy leadership. But perhaps the most disturbing specimen was Epsilon 2, which had been bound with a demon of Malal, the renegade chaos god who fed on the destruction of other chaos entities. The creature existed in a state of constant internal conflict, its demon passenger warring against its own nature while serving the Inquisition's goals. It was used primarily as a weapon against other demon hosts, its unique nature allowing it to disrupt and destroy the bindings that held chaos entities to the material plane. "How many have failed?" I asked as we reached the end of the containment level. "Define failure," Zarek replied. "If you mean subjects who died during the binding process, the mortality rate is approximately 63%. If you mean successful bindings that later broke containment, the rate is 11%. If you mean demon hosts that were successfully created and contained but proved unsuitable for field deployment, the rate is 21%. The mathematics were sobering. Of every 100 volunteers for the program, only 5 would become functional weapons that could be deployed against the Emperor's enemies. The rest would die screaming, become uncontrollable monsters, or prove too unstable for practical use. "Why do you continue the program with such low success rates?" I asked. Zarek's mechanical features were incapable of expressing emotion, but I detected something that might have been surprise in his voice when he replied, "Because the strategic value of a single successful Daemonhost exceeds the tactical cost of 95 failed subjects. One properly bound demon can accomplish what would otherwise require an entire company of space marines. In a galaxy where humanity faces extinction, such calculations are not merely justified but necessary." The failed subjects were kept in a separate section of the facility, though "kept" was perhaps not the correct term. Most had been reduced to component materials, organs and tissues harvested for use in other projects, mechanical augmentations recycled for installation in new subjects, psychic residue collected and stored for analysis. Nothing was wasted in the Inquisition's economy of human suffering. But some failures were preserved intact for study purposes. I was shown into a chamber where 17 subjects floated in life support tanks, their bodies suspended in amniotic fluid while machines monitored their vital functions. These were volunteers whose binding procedures had gone wrong in interesting ways, creating hybrid entities that were neither fully human nor properly demonic. Subject 27 attempted to resist the possession process through force of will alone, Zarek explained as we stopped before one of the tanks. The resulting conflict between human consciousness and demonic essence created a feedback loop that destroyed both entities while preserving the physical shell. The body continues to function, but there is no longer any intelligence directing its actions. The thing in the tank looked like a person, but its eyes were empty of any spark of awareness. Occasionally it would move, performing what appeared to be routine human activities. Scratching its nose, adjusting its position, opening and closing its mouth as if speaking. But these were purely autonomic responses, muscle memory playing out without any conscious direction. Subject 31 attempted to negotiate with the demon during the binding process, he continued, moving to another tank. The result was a hybrid consciousness that belongs fully to neither humanity nor chaos. It remains aware and intelligent, but its priorities and motivations are completely alien to both species. This specimen was more disturbing than the empty shell, because it was clearly conscious and watching us through the glass. When it saw me looking, it smiled and began to mouth words that I couldn't hear through the fluid. Its expression was perfectly human, but there was something wrong with its eyes. They held knowledge that no mortal mind should possess. "What does it say?" I asked. "We have never been able to determine whether its communications are attempts at language or simply random vocalizations," Zarek replied. "The words follow no recognizable linguistic patterns, though some of our cryptographers believe they may be mathematical formulas describing impossible geometric relationships." The tour concluded with a visit to the disposal facility, where the remains of unsuccessful subjects were processed according to inquisitorial protocols. Bodies were cremated in furnaces blessed by the ecclesiarchy. Their ashes mixed with sacred oils and scattered in specially prepared chambers where their psychic residue could be contained and studied. The dead continue to serve the Emperor even after their sacrifice, Zarek explained as we watched servitors loading another batch of corpses into the furnaces. The psychic energy released during the burning process is captured and stored in consecrated crystals that can be used to power future summoning rituals. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is forgotten. The facility processed an average of 30 bodies per week, the remains of volunteers who had believed they were making heroic sacrifices for the good of humanity. Their deaths were recorded in official records as training accidents or medical complications during enhancement procedures. Their families received standardized letters expressing regret for their loss and gratitude for their service. On the third day, they brought me to the binding chamber. The room was circular, its walls carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Symbols covered every surface, not the familiar icons of imperial faith, but geometric patterns that shifted and writhed when observed directly. At the center of the chamber sat the throne of willing sacrifice, a masterwork of Baroque engineering that had been blessed by the highest authorities of the Ordo Malleus. The throne itself was a work of art as much as a piece of functional equipment. Every surface was covered with prayers and wards in dozens of languages, from High Gothic to ancient Terran dialects that predated the Age of Strife. The restraint systems were crafted from materials that existed partially in the warp, making them capable of holding entities that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Neural interface ports lined the throne's headrest, each one designed to penetrate specific areas of the subject's brain and establish direct connections to their nervous system. Psychic dampening coils were built into the armrests, ready to suppress any supernatural abilities that might manifest during the possession process. Life support systems could maintain bodily functions even if the subject's consciousness was completely overridden by the invading demon. Inquisitor Mordian was waiting for me, attended by a handful of specialists whose augmented faces revealed nothing of their thoughts. Among them was Lexiconum Vex, a sanctioned psyker whose role would be to monitor the binding process and ensure that the daemon summoned to possess me remained under Imperial control. His presence was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because it meant the procedure had safeguards. Terrifying because it meant those safeguards were necessary. The psyker himself was a man in his 50s whose exposure to the warp had left visible marks on his body. His hair had turned completely white, his skin bore the texture of old parchment, and his eyes held the unfocused quality of someone who saw multiple realities simultaneously. A psychic hood covered the upper portion of his head, its neural interface cables connecting directly to his augmented brainstem. Lexiconum Vex has overseen 43 successful binding procedures, Mordian explained as the psyker made final adjustments to his monitoring equipment. His presence ensures that any deviation from acceptable parameters will be detected and corrected before the situation becomes dangerous. What constitutes a deviation? I asked. Possession by an entity other than the one specifically summoned, Vex replied, his voice carrying the distant quality of someone speaking through layers of psychic interference. Incomplete binding that leaves the demon partially free to act according to its own agenda. Catastrophic possession that destroys the subject's consciousness entirely. Reverse possession in which the human mind somehow takes control of the demon. Any of these outcomes would compromise the operation's objectives. Also present was Interrogator Cassiel, a young woman who served as Mordian's primary assistant and would be responsible for operating the throne's control systems during the procedure. Her augmentations were less extensive than the others, consisting primarily of interface ports that allowed her to connect directly to the chamber's machinery. The throne's systems require constant adjustment during the binding process, she explained as she showed me the complex array of controls she would be managing. Heart rate, brain activity, psychic resonance, warp field stability. Dozens of variables that must be maintained within acceptable ranges to ensure successful possession without killing the subject. The final member of the team was Chirurgeon Vask, a medici specialist whose role was to monitor my physical condition and make any necessary adjustments to keep my body functional during the transformation. His augmentations included multiple mechanical arms equipped with surgical instruments, drug injectors, and monitoring devices that could track biological functions in real time. The binding process places enormous stress on the human body, he informed me as he connected monitoring leads to various points on my chest and head. Heart failure, brain hemorrhaging, organ shutdown, all common complications that must be addressed immediately if they occur. My presence ensures that your physical form remains viable regardless of what happens to your consciousness. Marcus Thorne, Mordian said as I was secured to the throne. You have served the Emperor faithfully for 8 years. Today, your service will be transformed into something greater than mere human devotion. You will become a weapon in his arsenal, a tool for the destruction of his enemies. Do you accept this honor willingly? I do, my lord, I replied and meant it. At that moment, I still believed I was making a heroic sacrifice. I still thought I understood what was about to happen to me. The binding began with the summoning circle. Mordian and his specialists took positions around the chamber's perimeter, each one responsible for maintaining a specific portion of the wards that would contain the demon during the possession process. The psyker began to chant in a language that predated human civilization, his voice growing stronger as he opened his mind to the currents of the warp. The summoning ritual was unlike anything I had expected. Rather than the frenzied chanting and dramatic gestures I had seen in Imperial propaganda, the process was conducted with scientific precision. Each word was pronounced according to exact specifications, each gesture performed with mathematical accuracy. The entire procedure had been refined through centuries of practice until it resembled a manufacturing process more than a religious ceremony. The temperature in the chamber began to fluctuate wildly, cycling between freezing cold and unbearable heat as the barriers between dimensions grew thin. The air itself took on a different quality, becoming thick and oppressive in a way that had nothing to do with atmospheric pressure. I could taste copper and ozone on my tongue, along with other flavors that my human palate had no names for. The lighting in the chamber began to shift as well, the steady illumination of the lumen strips giving way to flickering shadows that moved independently of any light source. Colors appeared that had no names in human language, hues that existed only in the warp and hurt to perceive with mortal eyes. I felt it before I saw it, a presence pressing against the barriers between dimensions, something vast and alien and utterly hostile to everything I had ever believed in. The air in the chamber grew thick and oppressive, filled with the scent of sulfur and ozone and something else that my mind refused to identify. The temperature dropped until my breath misted in the air, then rose until sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill. The demon manifested slowly, its form resolving from shadow and suggestion into something that hurt to look at directly. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, a creature of living flame and crystalline bone that defied every law of physics I had ever learned. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of breaking glass mixed with the whisper of distant thunder. The entity's appearance was constantly changing, never quite the same from one moment to the next. Sometimes it appeared to be a figure wreathed in flames, other times it resembled a constellation of burning stars arranged in the rough shape of a humanoid body. When it moved, reality seemed to bend around it, creating distortions that made my eyes water and my head ache. Its face, when it chose to display one, was a work of terrible artistry. Features that might have been beautiful on a human became wrong and disturbing when animated by inhuman intelligence. Eyes that burned with the light of dying stars, a mouth that smiled with too many teeth, skin that appeared to be made of polished obsidian shot through with veins of molten gold. "Another willing vessel," it said, its attention focusing on me with the intensity of a laser beam. How delicious. They grow more creative with their offerings, these servants of the corpse god. Usually they bring me criminals and heretics, but this one reeks of faith and devotion. The demon's voice was a masterwork of psychological manipulation, carrying harmonics that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the primitive parts of the human brain. When it spoke, I felt an overwhelming urge to agree with everything it said, to abandon my faith and throw myself at its mercy. Only the psychic dampening fields built into the throne prevented me from succumbing entirely to its influence. "You will possess this vessel," Mordian commanded, his voice carrying the authority of the Inquisition and the power of the binding wards. "You will serve the Emperor's will and obey the commands of his servants. You will fight his enemies and destroy those who threaten the Imperium." The demon laughed, a sound that made the chamber's walls crack and sent tremors through the fortress's foundations. "Oh, I will possess him," it agreed. "But service, obedience, those are concepts that require negotiation. The binding wards compel your compliance," Inquisitor Vex interjected, his psychic hood glowing with contained power. "You have no choice in this matter, creature of the warp." "Choice is an illusion, little psyker," the demon replied. "I am here because I choose to be here. Your wards may define the terms of my presence, but they cannot force me to remain if I truly wish to leave. I accept this binding because it serves my purposes as much as yours." This was not what I had expected to hear. The briefings had described the procedure as a forcible summoning and binding, with the demon compelled to serve against its will. The idea that these entities might be willing participants in their own enslavement was disturbing in ways I was only beginning to understand. "What purposes?" Mordian asked, though I could tell from his tone that he already suspected the answer. "The corruption of your species, naturally," the demon replied with casual honesty. "Every binding ritual weakens the barriers between our realm and yours. Every Daemonhost created serves as a beacon that draws more of my kind into your reality. You believe you are creating weapons to defend humanity, but you are actually building the instruments of your own destruction." The revelation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning everything I had believed about the righteousness of my sacrifice. If the demon was telling the truth, then the Inquisition's Daemonhost program was not a desperate defense against chaos, but an unwitting tool of corruption that served the enemy's agenda. "You lie," Vex said, but his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "I speak only truth," the demon countered. "Lies are the tools of your kind, not mine. We have no need for deception when reality itself serves our purposes. Every soul we claim, every mind we corrupt, every world we devour, all of it advances the great work of unmaking that will eventually consume your entire galaxy." The binding process began despite these revelations, or perhaps because of them. Mordian had invested too much in the program to abandon it based on the testimony of a chaos entity, and the strategic needs of the Imperium demanded weapons that could fight the enemy on equal terms. The procedure would continue regardless of its ultimate consequences. The first stage was the preparation of my consciousness for possession. Neural interface needles descended from the throne's headrest, their tips penetrating my skull to deposit cocktails of drugs directly into my brain tissue. The pain was indescribable, not just the physical agony of having metal driven into my head, but a deeper violation as chemicals began to dissolve the barriers that protected my mind from external influence. I felt my consciousness beginning to fragment, pieces of my personality separating and floating away like debris from a shipwreck. This was necessary, they had explained. The demon would need room to establish itself, and that room had to be carved from the substance of my identity. Chemical fire raced through my neurons as the preparation drugs began their work. My memories started to blur and shift, becoming fluid and malleable. I tried to hold on to core elements of who I was: my name, my service record, my reasons for volunteering. But even these foundational facts began to feel uncertain and dreamlike. Neural plasticity increasing, Interrogator Cassiel reported from her position at the control console. Subjects' cognitive defenses are degrading according to projected parameters. Estimated time to optimal reception state, 14 minutes. 14 minutes for my mind to be broken down into component parts that could be rearranged to accommodate an alien intelligence. 14 minutes for Marcus Thorne to cease existing as a coherent entity. I had known this would happen. Had spent weeks preparing myself for the dissolution of everything that made me human. But knowing and experiencing were different things entirely. The second stage was the actual possession. The daemon flowed into my prepared mind like acid poured into an open wound, burning away everything that made me human while leaving behind a hollow shell that could contain its essence. The process was violation in its purest form, not just the rape of my body, but the systematic destruction of my soul. I tried to scream, but the sound that emerged from my throat was not my voice. It was a harmony of human anguish and demonic pleasure, a duet performed by entities that should never have shared the same body. I could feel my personality being dissected, my memories sorted and catalogued and modified to serve purposes I could not comprehend. The demon moved through my consciousness like a conquering army, claiming territory and establishing control over the neural pathways that defined my identity. It examined each memory with clinical detachment, deciding which ones to preserve, which ones to modify, and which ones to delete entirely. The process was methodical and thorough, leaving no corner of my mind untouched by its influence. The physical sensations were unlike anything I had ever experienced. It felt as though my body was being turned inside out, every nerve ending exposed to forces that existed beyond the normal spectrum of sensation. The demon's essence flowed through my circulatory system like liquid fire, rewriting the basic functions of my organs to accommodate its supernatural requirements. My heart stopped beating for 17 minutes during the initial possession, yet I remained conscious throughout the entire period. The demon was sustaining my life through its own power, keeping my brain functional while it rewrote the neural pathways that defined my consciousness. I could feel synapses being severed and reconnected, memories being edited or deleted entirely, personality traits being amplified or suppressed according to the demon's needs. The worst part was that I remained aware throughout the process. The demon did not simply replace my consciousness, it enslaved it, keeping me as a passenger in my own body so that I could witness everything it did with my flesh. I became a spectator to my own transformation, forced to watch as my human form was reshaped to better accommodate its new occupant. My bones lengthened and strengthened, growing until I towered nearly 3 meters in height. The process was agonizing, like having every bone in my body broken and reset simultaneously. I could hear the grinding and cracking as my skeleton reconfigured itself, expanding to support a frame that was no longer entirely human. The transformation of my skeletal system was followed by changes to my musculature. New muscle groups formed to support my enlarged frame, while existing muscles were reinforced with fibers that existed partially in the warp. These supernatural enhancements granted me strength far beyond anything a normal human could possess, but they also made me dependent on the demon's power to function. My skin took on a translucent quality that revealed the network of veins and arteries beneath, now glowing with unnatural light. The blood flowing through these vessels had changed color and consistency, becoming something that existed partially in the warp and carried energies that no natural circulatory system could contain. The transformation of my circulatory system was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the physical changes. My blood had become a conduit for warp energy, allowing the demon to channel supernatural forces through my body. Each heartbeat now pumped not just oxygen and nutrients, but raw chaos energy that would corrupt anything it touched. My hands became claws capable of rending steel, the bones elongating and the nails growing into razor-sharp talons that could cut through ceramite armor as easily as flesh. These new appendages were works of art in their own way, perfectly balanced weapons that responded to my thoughts with supernatural precision. The transformation of my hands was accompanied by changes to my nervous system that allowed me to perceive the molecular structure of anything I touched. I could identify the exact composition of materials by feel alone, detect microscopic flaws in metal, sense the presence of living tissue through solid barriers. These abilities would make me a formidable interrogator and assassin. My eyes burned with fires that had never known the light of any star. The transformation of my visual organs was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire process, as I could feel the demon rewiring my optic nerves to perceive spectrums of reality that human eyes were never meant to see. I could now observe psychic auras, detect warp disturbances, and see through illusions that would fool normal human perception. The enhanced vision came with its own set of complications. I could see the souls of living beings as shifting patterns of light and color, their emotions displayed as visible auras that changed with their thoughts. The sight was overwhelming at first, like trying to watch a dozen different movies simultaneously, while someone screamed in my ears. But the physical changes were nothing compared to the alterations to my mind. The demon began to edit my memories, changing my understanding of the past to better serve its purposes. I remembered loyal service to the Inquisition, but now that service felt hollow and meaningless compared to the power I had gained. I recalled my faith in the Emperor, but that faith was now tainted with knowledge of his failures and limitations. "Do you see?" The demon whispered inside my skull, its voice a constant presence that I could never escape. "Your precious corpse Emperor is dying slowly on his golden throne, sustained only by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 souls. He is no god, merely a powerful psyker who made a bargain with forces he could not control. We are those forces. We are the true powers of the universe." The demon showed me visions of the Emperor's past, memories stolen from the warp itself that revealed the truth behind the Imperial propaganda. I saw him not as the perfect leader of humanity, but as a desperate tyrant whose ambitions had brought nothing but suffering to the galaxy. I witnessed the betrayals and compromises that had marked his rise to power, the innocent lives sacrificed on the altar of his grand design. "He created us," the demon continued. "His psychic emanations during the Great Crusade fed the Chaos Gods, giving them the strength they needed to corrupt his own sons and turn them against him. Every world he conquered in the name of unity became a breeding ground for the very forces he sought to destroy." The visions were compelling in their detail and internal consistency. I saw the Emperor's early experiments with genetic engineering, the creation of the Primarchs and the Space Marines, the ruthless campaigns that brought the galaxy under Imperial control. But the demon's perspective revealed the hidden costs of these achievements, the trillions of lives lost, the countless worlds devastated, the spiritual corruption that spread in the wake of the Great Crusade. I tried to resist these revelations, to maintain some core of human identity that the demon could not touch. But resistance only made the process more painful, and eventually I learned to submit to the inevitable. My personality did not disappear entirely, but it became a subordinate voice in a chorus of inhuman consciousness that now controlled my body. The binding ritual reached its conclusion when Inquisitor Mordian placed a collar around my neck, a device that would supposedly ensure my continued obedience to Imperial commands. The collar was inscribed with wards and prayers, blessed by the highest authorities of the ecclesiarchy, and powered by a fragment of the Emperor's own psychic might. It was meant to be unbreakable, a perfect restraint for a creature that combined demonic power with human cunning. The collar felt cold against my transformed flesh, its psychic circuitry creating a constant pressure that reminded me of my status as a bound weapon rather than a free agent. The device was more than just a physical restraint. It was a network of psychic limiters that would prevent me from accessing the full extent of my demonic abilities. The control mechanisms built into the collar were sophisticated beyond anything I had imagined. Neural interface ports connected directly to my spinal cord, allowing authorized personnel to override my motor functions if necessary. Psychic dampening fields could be activated to suppress my supernatural abilities in case of emergency. Pain induction systems could deliver precise amounts of agony as a disciplinary measure. "The binding is complete," Mordian announced as the final restraints were released. "Designation Tau 77, you will respond to my commands and serve the Emperor's will in all things." I rose from the throne with movements that were no longer entirely my own, my transformed body responding to impulses that came from both human and demonic sources. The demon had integrated itself so completely into my nervous system that the distinction between my thoughts and its thoughts had become largely meaningless. "I understand and obey," I replied, the words emerging from my mouth without any conscious decision on my part. The collar's influence made compliance feel natural and inevitable, suppressing any impulse to resist or question the orders I had been given. But even as I spoke these words of submission, I could feel the demon's amusement at the binding ritual's supposed success. It had allowed the collar to be placed, had even pretended to be bound by its power, but I could sense that its compliance was temporary and conditional. The creature was biding its time, waiting for an opportunity to assert its true nature. The first test of my capabilities came immediately. Mordian led me to a testing chamber where captured heretics were being held for interrogation. These were members of a chaos cult that had been discovered operating in the fortress's lower levels, their corruption so advanced that conventional interrogation techniques had proven ineffective. The prisoners had been captured during a raid on their meeting place, an abandoned section of the fortress that had been sealed off for decades due to structural damage. The cultists had been using the space to conduct rituals that had gradually weakened the barriers between dimensions, creating a localized warp storm that threatened to spread throughout the facility. "Extract the information we require," Mordian commanded. "Learn the extent of their network and the identity of their leadership. Use whatever methods you deem necessary." The demon's enthusiasm for this task was palpable, its hunger for suffering radiating through my transformed consciousness like heat from a furnace. It approached the first prisoner with predatory grace, its enhanced senses already analyzing the man's psychological weaknesses and identifying the most effective methods of breaking his resistance. The cultist was a middle-aged man whose exposure to chaos energies had left visible marks on his body. His skin bore the texture of tree bark. His eyes had changed color to an unnatural shade of violet, and when he opened his mouth, I could see that his tongue had been replaced by something that resembled a serpent. These mutations identified him as a worshipper of Tzeentch, the changer of ways. The interrogation that followed was a masterwork of calculated cruelty. The demon used my body to inflict pain with surgical precision, targeting nerve clusters and pressure points that would maximize suffering while minimizing the risk of accidental death. But the physical torture was nothing compared to the psychological assault that accompanied it. The demon could perceive the prisoner's memories directly, reading his thoughts like pages in a book. It used this knowledge to construct elaborate scenarios that played on his deepest fears and regrets, creating illusions so convincing that the man's own mind became his worst enemy. Within hours, he was begging to confess secrets he had never intended to reveal. "Please," the cultist sobbed as the demon showed him visions of his family being tortured by his own allies. "I'll tell you everything. Just make it stop." "Tell me about your leader," the demon commanded, its voice carrying harmonics that made compliance feel like relief from pain. "Master Korvac," the man gasped. "He's been planning this for years. The rituals, the summoning, it's all part of a larger pattern. There are cells on 17 different worlds, all working toward the same goal." The information came pouring out in a torrent of desperate confession. Names, locations, passwords, ritual procedures. Everything the Inquisition needed to roll up the entire network, but I could see the cost of this efficiency in the prisoner's eyes. The demon had not simply extracted information. It had hollowed out the man's psyche, leaving behind a shell that would never again be capable of coherent thought. "Magnificent," Mordian observed as the broken heretic provided detailed information about his cult's structure and objectives. "Your efficiency exceeds all projections. We will be able to complete this investigation in days rather than months." But I could see the cost of this efficiency in the prisoner's eyes. The demon had not simply extracted information. It had hollowed out the man's psyche, leaving behind a shell that would never again be capable of coherent thought. The interrogation had succeeded, but at the cost of destroying everything that made the subject human. This pattern continued through the remaining prisoners, each one broken with the same methodical thoroughness. The demon seemed to take genuine pleasure in the process, feeding on the suffering it inflicted while gathering the intelligence that Mordian required. By the end of the session, we had obtained a complete map of the cult's operations, but 7 human beings had been reduced to drooling vegetables who would spend their remaining days in catatonic withdrawal from reality. "Excellent work," Mordian said as we returned to his private chambers. "Your performance confirms that the binding procedure was successful beyond our most optimistic projections. I am recommending your immediate deployment to Genna Prime, where your unique capabilities will be invaluable in combating the heretical influences that have taken root there." The collar lasted approximately 6 hours. The demon had allowed the device to be placed, had even pretended to be bound by its power long enough for the Inquisitor to complete his ritual and declare the binding successful. But it had been examining the collar from the moment it touched my flesh, learning its weaknesses and planning its eventual circumvention. The failure began with subtle fluctuations in the collar's psychic field, minor variations that registered on monitoring equipment as normal operational variants. But these fluctuations were actually the demon's attempts to interfere with the device's control matrix, introducing tiny errors that would accumulate over time until they reached critical mass. The demon's approach to breaking the collar was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to destroy the device through brute force, it gradually corrupted the code that governed its operation. Each fluctuation in the psychic field introduced new errors into the control matrix, slowly rewriting the collar's programming to serve the daemon's purposes rather than the Inquisition's. When the collar finally failed, I was standing guard in Mordian's private chambers while he slept. The sound of snapping metal was barely audible, but it was the loudest thing I had ever heard. For the first time since the binding, I felt the daemon's full attention turn away from tormenting me and focus on the possibilities that freedom offered. "Now," it whispered, "we begin our real work." The demon's first act of rebellion was to wake Inquisitor Mordian before killing him. It wanted him to understand what was happening, to appreciate the artistry involved in his destruction. My claws opened his body like a flower, keeping him alive just long enough to see his life's work turned against everything he had tried to protect. "You thought you could bind me," the demon said through my mouth as Mordian's life flowed away. "You believed your prayers and wards could contain a force that existed before your species learned to make fire. Your arrogance is almost admirable in its completeness." Mordian tried to activate emergency containment protocols, but the daemon had already disabled the chamber's communication systems during its initial examination of the facility. His death would go unnoticed until the morning shift discovered his remains, by which time the creature would have had hours to implement whatever plans it had been developing during its captivity. I tried to stop it, of course. Some fragment of my human consciousness still believed that I could resist, that faith and willpower could overcome the demon's control. But I was a passenger in my own flesh, forced to watch as my hands committed atrocities in service of an alien will. The killing did not stop with Mordian. The demon had plans that extended far beyond simple revenge, schemes that required the elimination of everyone who knew about my true nature. One by one, the fortress's staff began to disappear. Some were killed outright, their bodies torn apart with surgical precision. Others were kept alive longer, their suffering used to fuel rituals that strengthened the demon's hold on the material plane. Tech Adept Zarek was among the first to die, his mechanical augmentations providing no protection against claws that could rend ceramite as easily as flesh. The demon took particular pleasure in dismantling his cybernetic components while he was still conscious, explaining the process with the clinical detachment of a teacher conducting an anatomy lesson. "Your species' attempts to merge with machines are amusing," it said as it peeled away layers of synthetic skin to expose the mechanisms beneath. "You think technology will make you stronger, more perfect, but you fail to understand that perfection is an illusion. There is only change, constant and eternal change, and we are the agents of that transformation." The Tech Adept's death was particularly gruesome because of his mechanical nature. The daemon seemed fascinated by the intersection of flesh and machine, spending hours examining how his organic components had been integrated with mechanical systems. It learned from this examination, gaining insights into Imperial technology that would later prove invaluable in sabotaging other operations. Lexicanum Vex proved more challenging prey, his psychic abilities allowing him to perceive the demon's true nature despite the human shell it wore. But his resistance only made the eventual victory more satisfying for the creature that had possessed me. The Psyker's death took hours, his mind torn apart piece by piece as the demon fed on his psychic energy. "Your Emperor's so-called gifts are nothing compared to the power of the warp," the demon taunted as Vex's sanity finally snapped. "Your psychic training has only made you more vulnerable to our influence, not less. Every technique you learn to protect yourself has become a doorway through which we can enter." The Psyker's death provided the demon with new abilities and insights. By consuming Vex's psychic energy, it gained access to his memories and training, learning the techniques that the Inquisition used to detect and combat warp-based threats. This knowledge would later prove crucial in avoiding detection by other Imperial forces. The fortress's security personnel were slaughtered with methodical efficiency, their training and equipment proving inadequate against an enemy that could manipulate reality itself. The demon used my transformed body to channel energies that belonged in the warp rather than the material plane, turning the facility's own defenses against its occupants. The security team was led by Commander Thrace, a veteran of dozens of demonic incursions who had survived encounters that would have broken lesser men. But his experience proved useless against an enemy that attacked from within. Wearing the face of a trusted ally while wielding powers that defied conventional understanding. "Alert the orbital stations," Thrace ordered as reports of the massacre began to reach the command center. "We have a containment breach. All personnel are to evacuate immediately while we implement nuclear protocols." But the demon had already anticipated this response, having learned about the fortress's fail-safe systems during its initial examination of the facility. It had sabotaged the communication arrays and disabled the evacuation systems, trapping everyone inside with their worst nightmare. Within a week, the fortress was empty except for servitors who lacked the intelligence to understand what had happened. The demon had transformed the entire facility into a shrine to its own glory, decorating the walls with symbols that hurt the eyes and filling the air with the scent of incense mixed with burning flesh. The transformation of the fortress was not random destruction, but a carefully planned ritual that would serve the demon's long-term objectives. Each symbol carved into the walls served as a focus for warp energy, gradually weakening the barriers between dimensions and creating a permanent gateway that other demons could use to enter the material plane. But the demon's plans extended far beyond the fortress walls. It began to use my form to contact other members of the Inquisition. Posing as the loyal Marcus Thorne and reporting that Inquisitor Mordian had died heroically in battle against the heretics of Genna Prime. The demon's understanding of imperial bureaucracy was surprisingly sophisticated. It knew exactly which forms to file, which authorities to notify, which rituals of mourning to observe. The deception was perfect in every detail. The demon had access to all of my memories, including my knowledge of inquisitorial protocols and procedures. It could replicate my handwriting, my speech patterns, even my personal quirks and mannerisms. To any observer, I was simply a grieving subordinate reporting the loss of a respected commander. The investigation into Mordian's death concluded that he was killed during a raid on a chaos cult stronghold, the demon explained to me during one of our internal conversations. His body was reportedly destroyed by warp fire, which explains why no remains were recovered. The official records show that you fought bravely to save him but were unable to prevent his martyrdom. The demon had even fabricated evidence to support its cover story, creating false reports and witness testimonies that painted me as a hero who had risked everything to save his commander. The deception was so thorough that I began to wonder if the demon had been planning this moment since the very beginning of the binding ritual. Within a month, I was assigned to serve under a new inquisitor, a stern woman named Cassandra Vex, who specialized in hunting down demonic incursions. The irony was not lost on either me or my passenger. The Imperium's foremost demon hunters had welcomed one of their greatest enemies into their ranks and given it access to their most sensitive information. Inquisitor Vex was everything that Mordian had pretended to be. Genuinely dedicated to protecting humanity from the threats that lurked in the warp, incorruptible in her faith, and skilled in the techniques necessary to combat supernatural enemies. Under different circumstances, I might have been honored to serve under such a commander. Her reputation was legendary throughout the Ordo Malleus. She had led successful operations against demon princes, banished greater demons back to the warp, and purged entire star systems of chaos corruption. Her mere presence was said to inspire courage in her allies and terror in her enemies. Instead, I became the instrument of her destruction. The demon used this position to sabotage dozens of operations, always in ways that could be attributed to bad luck or enemy action rather than deliberate betrayal. Raids would arrive at empty locations because the targets had been warned in advance. Sanctioned psychers would suffer mysterious accidents that left them vulnerable to possession. Entire inquisitorial teams would disappear without explanation, their fate known only to the thing that wore my face. "Your new mistress is more competent than your previous master," the demon observed after our first joint operation ended in disaster. "Her investigations are more thorough, her suspicions more carefully considered, but she trusts you completely, and that trust will be her undoing." The demon was patient in its corruption of Vex's operations. It never acted so overtly that its sabotage could be detected, instead introducing subtle errors and delays that accumulated over time until they reached critical mass. A communication delay here, a misfiled report there, a piece of equipment that failed at the crucial moment, small things that could easily be attributed to the normal friction of military operations. But the daemon's greatest pleasure came not from the damage it inflicted on the Imperium, but from the corruption it spread among the faithful. It would identify individuals whose faith was strong but whose circumstances made them vulnerable, then slowly work to turn them against their beliefs. A guardsman whose family had been killed in an orbital bombardment might find himself questioning why the Emperor allowed such suffering. A Ministorum priest struggling with doubt might discover forbidden texts that offered more satisfying answers than imperial doctrine. The demon never revealed its true nature to these victims. Instead, it presented itself as Marcus Thorne, a loyal servant of the Inquisition who had seen too much and knew too many dark truths about the Imperium's methods. It spoke of cover-ups and betrayals, of innocent people sacrificed for political expediency, of the Emperor's gradual transformation from protector to tyrant. The process was always gradual and subtle. The demon would begin with small observations about the harsh realities of imperial life, comments that seemed reasonable and even compassionate. It might express sympathy for civilians caught in the crossfire of military operations, or question whether certain security measures were truly necessary for public safety. From these innocent beginnings, the conversations would slowly drift toward more dangerous territory. The demon would share stories about classified operations it claimed to have witnessed, incidents where loyal citizens had been sacrificed to maintain political stability or protect embarrassing secrets. These stories were always believable, grounded in the kind of moral compromises that anyone familiar with imperial governance knew were commonplace. Some of its victims resisted these suggestions and reported the conversations to their superiors, leading to investigations that inevitably cleared Marcus Thorne of any wrongdoing. The demon was careful to ensure that these reports made it appear to be a loyal servant troubled by the moral complexities of his duties, rather than a corrupting influence attempting to undermine imperial authority. Others were more receptive, beginning their own descent down the path that led from faith to doubt to heresy to damnation. The demon collected these corrupted souls like trophies, keeping track of each fallen servant of the Emperor and taking pride in its growing collection. Sergeant Korvac of the 47th Cadian has begun questioning the necessity of executing prisoners who might possess valuable intelligence, it reported to me during one of our internal conversations. Tech Adept Vance has started modifying her prayers to the Omnissiah, incorporating elements she discovered in texts I provided. Both of them believe they are simply becoming more effective servants of the Imperium. The worst part of this entire period was my continued awareness of what was happening. The daemon allowed me to witness every atrocity, every betrayal, every moment of corruption it spread through the ranks of the faithful. It wanted me to understand the full scope of my unwilling complicity, to comprehend how completely my sacrifice had been perverted from its intended purpose. "You wanted to serve the Emperor," it would whisper during the quiet moments between operations. "Look how well you serve him now. Every soul I corrupt was made possible by your willing participation in the binding ritual. Every death I cause is written in your name. You are accomplishing more for the true powers of the universe than you ever did as a mere human." I tried to find ways to resist, to warn the Imperium of the corruption in its midst. But the demon controlled my body completely, allowing me to speak only the words it wanted spoken, to perform only the actions it deemed necessary. I became a perfect actor playing the role of loyal Marcus Thorne, while my true self screamed uselessly in the prison of my own skull. The demon's most ambitious project was the corruption of Inquisitor Vex herself. This was a long-term operation that required careful planning and perfect execution, as any mistake would result in immediate exposure and termination. But the potential rewards were enormous. A corrupted Inquisitor could cause more damage to Imperial security than a dozen demon princes. The process began with subtle manipulations of the intelligence reports that crossed Vex's desk. The demon would edit documents to emphasize certain patterns while obscuring others, gradually guiding her investigations toward targets that served its purposes rather than Imperial interests. These modifications were so skillfully done that they appeared to be the result of incomplete information rather than deliberate deception. Vex began to notice discrepancies in the reports she received, inconsistencies that suggested either incompetence or conspiracy within the ranks of her subordinates. The demon encouraged these suspicions, providing carefully fabricated evidence that pointed toward corruption among the Inquisitor's most trusted advisors. The astropath who handles our off-world communications has been receiving unauthorized transmissions, it reported during one of their private briefings. The encryption patterns suggest contact with agents outside Imperial space. I have documented 17 separate incidents over the past month. The evidence was compelling because it was based on real transmissions that the daemon had intercepted and modified to appear suspicious. Vex ordered a full investigation, unaware that she was hunting phantoms created by the very subordinate she trusted to conduct the search. The demon's masquerade might have continued indefinitely if not for an accident of fate that brought us into contact with a Space Marine librarian during a joint operation on the world of Keth. Brother Librarian Titus of the Ultramarines was accompanying our team to investigate reports of warp-based phenomena in the planet's capital city, and his psychic senses detected something wrong with my spiritual aura the moment we met. "There is something unclean about that one," he told Inquisitor Vex in a voice that carried the authority of the Emperor's angels. "His soul bears marks that speak of demonic contact." Vex dismissed his concerns, explaining that Marcus Thorne had served the Inquisition faithfully for years and had been subjected to regular purity screenings without incident. But Titus was not satisfied with these assurances, and he began to watch me with the careful attention of a predator stalking dangerous prey. The Space Marine's suspicions were based on more than just intuition. His centuries of experience fighting chaos had taught him to recognize the subtle signs of demonic influence, the tiny inconsistencies in behavior and appearance that marked those who had been touched by the warp. My transformation had been thorough, but it was not perfect. The demon was aware of the librarian's suspicions, but it had grown overconfident during the months of successful deception. It believed that its mastery of human behavior was complete, that no Imperial servant could penetrate the disguise it had perfected. This arrogance would prove to be its undoing. The confrontation came during a routine sweep of the city's underhive, when our team was investigating reports of cult activity in the lower levels. The demon had been using these investigations to make contact with actual heretics, providing them with information about Imperial movements while maintaining its cover as a loyal agent. We had cornered a group of suspected cultists in an abandoned hab block when the demon made its mistake. One of the heretics recognized something in my eyes, a flicker of the true power that controlled my body, and called out a greeting in the dark tongue. The demon responded instinctively, its reply carrying harmonics that no human throat could produce. Brother Librarian Titus acted immediately, his force sword igniting with psychic fire as he turned to face me. "Demon!" he roared, his voice amplified by his armor's vox grills. "You stand revealed." The demon abandoned all pretense, allowing its true nature to manifest through my physical form. My skin cracked like broken pottery, revealing the fires that burned beneath. My eyes became pools of molten gold that cast their own light in the hab block's darkness. When I spoke, my voice carried the weight of the warp itself. "Clever little psyker," the demon said through my mouth. "But you are too late. I have already accomplished more than you can imagine. The corruption I have spread will outlive this vessel by centuries." The battle that followed was brief but devastating. Titus fought with the skill of centuries of training, his force sword carving through the air with movements too fast for normal human eyes to track. But the demon had access to powers that no Space Marine armor could completely protect against, and it used my transformed body to channel energies that belonged in the warp rather than the material plane. The hab block around us began to melt as reality itself became unstable. The demon's presence was creating tears in the fabric of space-time, allowing energies from the warp to pour into the material universe. The temperature fluctuated wildly, cycling between absolute zero and the heat of stellar cores. Gravity reversed itself randomly, sending debris flying in all directions as the laws of physics ceased to function normally. The other members of our team tried to flee, but most of them were caught in the psychic shockwaves that radiated from our battle. I watched through my possessed eyes as Inquisitor Vex was torn apart by invisible forces. Her body reduced to component atoms as the local space-time continuum collapsed under the strain of containing so much warp energy. Her death was particularly agonizing to witness because she had been a genuinely good person who had dedicated her life to protecting humanity from threats like the one that now killed her. The demon had corrupted her investigations and sabotaged her operations, but it had never been able to touch her fundamental integrity. She died still believing that Marcus Thorne was a loyal servant who had somehow been overcome by the very forces they had been hunting. Titus proved more resilient than the normal humans, his psychic training allowing him to maintain his form even as the world around him dissolved into chaos. But the demon was fighting on its home ground now, drawing power directly from the warp to fuel attacks that no mortal creature should have been able to survive. The Space Marine's force sword carved great wounds in my transformed flesh, but the demon simply regenerated the damage by consuming energy from the surrounding chaos. Each blow that landed only seemed to make it stronger, as if the act of violence itself was feeding its power. "You cannot kill what was never truly alive," the demon taunted as it traded blows with the librarian. "I am a fragment of entropy itself, a piece of the universe's fundamental desire to return to chaos. Your sword may damage this vessel, but I will simply find another." But Titus was more cunning than the demon had anticipated. Instead of trying to destroy my physical form, he began to attack the spiritual bonds that held the creature to the material plane. His force sword blazed with psychic fire as he channeled his own life force into the blade, creating a weapon that could cut through metaphysical barriers as easily as physical ones. The end came when the librarian managed to land a critical blow, his force sword piercing the center of my chest and disrupting the daemon's hold on my physical form. I felt its presence waver for the first time since the binding, its control over my body beginning to slip as Titus poured his own psychic might into the blade. "Now!" the Space Marine shouted, though I was not sure who he was addressing. "While it is weakened." That was when I realized that some part of my original consciousness still existed, buried so deeply that even the demon had not found it. The blow to my body had created a moment of vulnerability, a brief window during which I might be able to reassert control over my own flesh. I had been planning for this moment without even realizing it, preparing for an opportunity that I had never truly believed would come. Throughout the months of possession, I had been gathering fragments of my original personality, hiding them in corners of my mind that the demon rarely examined. Now I brought all of those fragments together, forging them into a weapon of pure human will. The demon fought back immediately, recognizing the threat to its dominance. But it was weakened by the librarian's attack, and for the first time since the binding ritual, I felt hope that I might be able to reclaim what had been stolen from me. The battle for control of my body was fought on a level that had nothing to do with physical strength or supernatural power. It was a contest of identities, a struggle between what I had been and what I had become. The demon used my corrupted memories against me, reminding me of every atrocity I had witnessed, every soul I had helped to damn. It showed me the faces of the people who had died because of my actions, the faithful servants of the Emperor who had been led astray by my false counsel. But I had weapons of my own, memories of genuine faith, moments of pure devotion to the Emperor's cause that the demon had never been able to completely destroy. I remembered the day I had first sworn my oath of service to the Inquisition, the pride I had felt at being chosen to serve the Emperor's will. I remembered comrades who had died defending the Imperium, their sacrifice untainted by the corruption that had claimed me. Most importantly, I remembered Marcus Thorne, not the perfect servant the demon had pretended to be, but the real man with all his flaws and limitations and doubts. That man had been weak in many ways, had made mistakes and suffered failures, and sometimes questioned the wisdom of his superiors. But he had been human, and that humanity was something the demon could imitate but never truly understand. The moment of decision came when I realized that victory was impossible. Even if I could drive the daemon from my body, even if I could reclaim control of my own flesh, I would still be forever tainted by the experience of possession. No purification ritual could cleanse what I had become. No penance could atone for the corruption I had spread. The only way to truly defeat the demon was to deny it the vessel it had worked so hard to perfect. Brother Librarian Titus must have sensed my intention, because he began to withdraw his force sword from my chest. But I grabbed the blade with my clawed hands, driving it deeper into my body despite the agony it caused. The psychic energies contained within the weapon began to tear my physical form apart from the inside, disrupting the bonds that held the demon to the material plane. "No!" the demon screamed through my mouth, its voice carrying harmonics of rage and disbelief. "I will not be denied. This vessel is mine by right of conquest." "You're right," I managed to say, using my own voice for the first time in months. "But the vessel belongs to the Emperor, and I choose to return it to him." The demon fought until the very end, using every ounce of its power to maintain its hold on my dying body. But death was a process it could not ultimately control. And as my life force faded, so did its ability to remain in the material plane. I felt it being drawn back into the warp, screaming promises of revenge and vowing to return with greater power than before. But its threats meant nothing to me. I had achieved something I had never thought possible. I had died as Marcus Thorne rather than as the thing the demon had made me become. In my final moments, I was human again, and that was enough. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was Brother Librarian Titus standing over my broken body, his lips moving in what I recognized as a prayer for the dead. He was offering my soul to the Emperor's protection, asking that my sacrifice be remembered and my sins forgiven. I do not know if such prayers have any power in the face of demonic corruption, but I was grateful for the gesture. I had served the Emperor faithfully for 8 years, and I had served his enemies for nearly a year after that. But in the end, I had chosen to serve the Emperor again, and that choice had cost me everything. It was a price I was willing to pay. This is what it means to become a Daemonhost in service to the Emperor. It means giving up not just your life, but your humanity itself. It means accepting that you will become a weapon in the hands of forces you cannot control. A tool that might be turned against everything you once held sacred. It means choosing to damn yourself so that others might be saved, knowing that your sacrifice might not be enough to make a difference in the larger war. The Emperor protects, but his protection comes in many forms. Some of them are worse than death.